Hello everyone and welcome to APS webinars. The title of today's webinar is Technology and Commercialization 101. I'm Crystal Bailey and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Thank you all so much for joining us. APS webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. Today's presentation features Peter Fiske, who will outline the basic concepts and key issues involved in commercializing technological innovations, especially those coming out of academic or national lab research. So if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the questions panel located on the right side of your screen. You may submit questions through the questions panel at any time during the webinar, and we will answer all of your questions at the end. We will do our best to cover all the questions you submit, but apologize if we're unable to cover everything. Finally, a link to the recording of today's presentation will be emailed to you after today's event and will be made available on the Summer Webinar Series homepage. It'll take about 48 hours for us to complete that upload, so you can expect that email in about 48 hours. Also, we encourage you to complete the survey upon exiting so that APS webinars can improve its ability to provide you with these valuable services. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll introduce Peter. Peter is the Executive Director for the National Alliance for Water Innovation, a coalition between labs, universities, and U.S. water companies committed to developing game-changing technologies to enable distributed desalination and water reuse. He is also a seasoned executive with more than 2 decades of experience leading technology organizations and initiatives that have touched on optics and semiconductor manufacturing, biomimicry-inspired high-efficiency fluid mixing and process control technology, and has served as a board member or advisor to a number of technology startups. Peter is also a nationally recognized author and lecturer, teaching innovation, entrepreneurship, and personal career strategy to scientists and engineers in industry and research. He is a regular contributor to Nature and a past columnist for Science. His articles have also appeared in The New Scientist. Peter is also the author of Put Your Science to Work, the most widely read career strategy guide for early career scientists and engineers. He is a frequent keynote speaker and lecturer at leading research universities and has given his acclaimed 2-hour workshop to over 25,000 scientists and engineers in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. And I'll also mention that this webinar is one of 3 that Peter is actually very kindly doing for us over the course of our summer webinar series that all touch on themes around entrepreneurship. Our next one is value proposition and how to sell yourself to different funders or educators or any jobs, employers, anyone that you might want to appeal to. So I think there's going to be some valuable stuff covered, and I encourage you to please tune in. You can sign up for our summer webinar series to hear all of Peter's webinars. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Crystal, and everybody. It's great to talk to you today. I'm happy to be here. I'm calling you from Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and understand that we have listeners from around the country and even some people from abroad. So welcome. It's great to see all of you today. Normally I look like this, clean shaven and well dressed, and this is my COVID look. So hello everybody. That's why we're not doing webcams today, being a little bit scruffy here in California. But I wanted to also tell you that as Crystal noted, I'm going to actually be asking a couple questions early on in the webinar, and so I encourage you to open this chat window and you can type in your chat. Make sure it's to organizers and panelists, and then as questions come, you can type in those questions, and then we'll have a lively Q&A at the end with you typing in questions and me giving you responses. All right. So here we go. So first, a little bit about me. I know Crystal gave you a little bit of background, but I want to tell you I have my PhD in geosciences from Stanford, and then I was a postdoc at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, at that end of that experience, I thought, well, I'm done with science. I'm going to head off to Washington, D.C., and I became a White House fellow for a year working on science policy in the Pentagon, and very quickly realized that, maybe I should go back to science. So I went back to Lawrence Livermore Lab for another 4 years and worked as a research scientist in the physics directorate before finally, also at the same time in the evening, getting my MBA at UC Berkeley while still a scientist. But midway through that, decided to leave my research career and start a company. So my first company was Wrapped Industries, which I was the co-founder on, and ran that until I left in 2008, and then joined another company that was getting started, Pax Water Technologies, which I ran as CEO until 2017. Now, so there you go, and then surprise, surprise, Pax Water grew, we ended up selling the company, and I returned to research. So I want to show you, first of all, this kind of background of me. And one of the things you have to understand about careers is they really only make sense in the rearview mirror. A lot of people worry about, well, where can I go with a physics degree? How can I potentially leave academia? Can I ever come back? The answer is, of course you can come back, but everybody's story is different and unique. And so in addition to talking today about technology and commercialization, and talking this summer about critical career strategies for you, I encourage you to ask questions about my background and my career, which, as you can see, a little bit circuitous, but one thing that's been very important to me is it's been extremely satisfying and challenging, and has relied on my experience as a geoscientist. Now, the other thing Crystal mentioned was that I have all this time been writing and lecturing and publishing extensively on the subject of career development for scientists. And so part of this seminar series that Crystal and I came up with is reflecting not just on technology and commercialization, but on personal career strategies. Because ultimately, even entrepreneurship as a topic is something that is a personal choice. It's a choice for you at a certain point in your life, depending on the circumstances and opportunities that are in front of you. And so we'll talk about that in some of our later webinars as well. Well, I want to get started and invite you to open your chat window. And I want you to, first of all, think about this question. What is an invention? Everybody, open that chat window. People, type out what you would define as an invention. Can people do that for me? Oh, look, I see somebody typing in already. Invention is something new. Okay, yeah, makes a lot of sense. Somebody else writes, invention is something that is valuable. Yeah, that's true. Somebody else is writing here, an invention is how you start a business. Okay, that's very interesting. Somebody else is writing, invention is something that I am interested in. Okay, very good. All right, well, you're right. An invention is something that is new. And in fact, it is often something that's technical. And in fact, being a physicist, it's natural for you to be thinking a lot about how new technological inventions can lead to opportunities for technology commercialization and even starting a business. All right, so that's what an invention is. Tell me this, what is an innovation? People are pausing. Somebody writes in, an innovation is something new. Okay, well, I thought that's what an invention is, but that's all right. See, somebody else is writing in, an innovation is something that can be used to start a business. It's true. And let's see, somebody else here is writing, an innovation is something new and useful. Ha ha, very interesting. In fact, that is a critical difference. Inventions are new and they're often technical, but an innovation is something that's new and is also useful. And in particular, it's useful simply because it often disrupts the established order. And in that disruption or that change, it often leads to value. And that's the source of entrepreneurship. Now, the reason I bring this definition up is that the value systems in academia and industry are very different. And you've been spending your time in the academic, culture. And it's important to understand the distinctions, okay? In the academic culture, the best discovery that you make is something which is interesting, something that's interesting to you and your other colleagues in your sub-discipline, whether or not it's useful. However, in industry, the best discovery is something that is useful, whether or not it's interesting. And this distinction is one of the reasons why I think physicists can sometimes struggle in thinking about technology commercialization, because the academic culture encourages and often leads to inventions, and inventions are very nice. But unless one also thinks about utility, you are stuck with an invention and not necessarily an innovation. And that's going to be the core of what we talk about today, is how do you utilize some of the tools you've developed as a scientist to analyze whether an invention is potentially an innovation. Because there's lots of interesting stuff we can do. Lots of great, exciting, complicated science. But at the end of the day, if it's not useful and important and valuable to someone, it's probably not going to be commercialized. So I want to start by telling you that there's already a really, really valuable program that is out there that I am going to spend a few minutes telling you about, called the Innovation Core ICorre program. I can see actually somebody's writing in, I have taken the ICorre program. That's great. So in this program, this is a program run by the National Science Foundation, and it is specifically geared towards researchers and their undergraduates and graduate students who have received funding from NSF. But what this program does is it doesn't focus on technology, it focuses on understanding your business model that's enabled by the invention that you have developed. The process exists, and it's a program that involves multiple customer interviews and a team overseen by experienced technology entrepreneurs. The program itself runs 7 weeks, so it's very intensive, but it's pretty quick. It has a 3-day kickoff in person, 5 weeks of lectures that are done online in a flipped classroom setting, and then 2 days in a final closing workshop. But the bulk of the work is done by the teams who do more than 100 customer discovery interviews. And in that journey of customer discovery, they take their invention and their initial ideas as to why that invention was potentially valuable, and they go out and test the hypothesis using the same scientific methodology that you've learned as a physicist. Eventually, they get to a point at the end of the program where they have data to decide, am I going to proceed with an attempt to commercialize this invention, or am I going to move on to other things? Now, as I see from the chat window, some of you said that you already have participated in ICorre, and that's great, but I just wanted to point out that ICorre sites are now across the United States at many universities, including a number of the universities where you guys are. And there are also these nodes, these centers that aggregate resources for a bunch of different universities. The philosophy and the underlying curriculum for the ICorre program is based on this book, Business Model Generation. And I will tell you that anybody who is interested in technology commercialization should get this book. This book is, I think, to business sort of what Principia is to physics. It is really a foundational insight into how businesses work. And the key rubric or methodology that this book discusses is something called the business model canvas. And the business model canvas is a graphical tool that enables people to describe business and business ideas in a format that's relevant and applicable to any type of business. So they basically broken down businesses into some 9 key activities that are shown here on this graphic. And before I go into some details, I want to say that the business model canvas is to business sort of the same way that a cell diagram is to life. Because a cell, diagram shows you some of the key features and devices and functions that exist in every cell in order for a cell to work. So similarly, these 9 segments of the business model canvas are key functions within any business that enable that business to grow, just like the cell. And so just like a cell diagram, it's very general, this concept, but it's very powerful. And in this power is what we use as scientists to analyze whether our invention has the potential for technology commercialization. I'm going to focus on 2 specific elements out of the 9. The foundational element of the business model canvas is something called customer segment. It is simply the group of customers that your innovation addresses and the group of customers for whom your innovation really provides benefit. And it's often the case that when we think about an invention or a technology that we're working on, we say, oh, well, it'll be, the automotive industry is my customer segment. Because I'm working on catalysts for degrading carbon, sort of carbon compounds and making sure that fuels can burn more cleanly. Well, one of the things we learn in the ICORE program is that customer segments and customers are people. They're not industries. And ultimately, decisions on whether to adopt a new technology or whether to buy something are personal decisions made by people. And so one of the key concepts is you have to understand that there are people on the other side of your technology whose choice to adopt or not adopt is based on their needs. So customer segments on one side, and the other side is what we call value propositions. These are the set of key values that your invention or your innovation confers to that customer segment. And so just like an equation where you have values on either sides, similarly, you have value proposition on one side specific to a set of customer segments on the other side. Those two have to come together. And it's possible that you have an innovation that might address multiple customer segments. So it is likely that there are somewhat different value propositions for different customer segments. In fact, one of the ways that we define a customer segment, it's a group of people who would see the same value proposition from your innovation. And if a group of people, if a set of people would see somewhat different value propositions or different values from what you've done, that might suggest that they're actually part of 2 different customer segments. Okay, so the value proposition, this whole thing, I know it sounds kind of like, wow, it seems very general, but basically it's the benefit that the customer segment derives from adopting the product or service enabled by your innovation. Whatever you've done, whether it's a catalyst, whether it's a new optical transformer, whether it's a new algorithm, your value proposition is what that thing does for a specific customer segment. It's the benefit that they derive. And this is a challenge often for scientists because, we like, well, yeah, but the thing that I've done is this really cool algorithm and this really cool catalyst. It's like, what about my science or technology? Isn't that important? No, it is not important because customers don't care about technology. What they care about is solving a problem. And this is one of the kind of big challenges that I've seen in students and teams who go through the ICorps program, is that it's very natural, coming from a physics background, to focus on the technology and to believe that the technology itself is where the value resides in the opportunity. The answer is that technology simply enables the customer to do something different, hopefully better. And a customer doesn't particularly care if it's an algorithm or a catalyst or a material or anything. They care about what they are trying to do. So if my invention, my innovation is only valuable if it solves real problems for real customers in real environments, how do I find out? what their problems are. The answer, my friends, is you got to get out of the building. One of the key challenges in the academic world is that we are very used to doing research in a library or looking stuff up online. We do not have a lot of practice in science of leaving the campus and going out and interviewing people in the work environments where our innovation might be useful. And frankly, that is what people learn in the NSF ICorps program. It's one of the most challenging things they encounter, and also one of the most profoundly enlightening experiences they've had. So let me tell you a little bit about one of the teams I have worked with. So I teach in the Department of Energy's version of the ICorps program called Energy ICorps. And I'll tell you the story of one team out of Argonne National Lab, Anil Mane and Devika Chowdhury. These are two material scientists, physicists, and they have been working on a really exciting technology for coating the cathode material in a lithium-ion battery. Because normally lithium-ion batteries, when you cycle them, as you can see here, their capacity retention is okay, it's okay, and then it falls apart. And the reason it falls apart is that during the charging and discharging cycle, hydrogen fluoride, HF, which, as those of you who know chemistry know, that's a very corrosive compound. HF can be created right at the interface of the cathode. And so Anil and Devika came up with a really clever idea. Can we coat the cathode with a HF-resistant coating? And so, by doing that coating, could we, lengthen the life of batteries? And sure enough, their initial results and their coatings showed substantial improvements in lithium-ion lifetime, battery lifetimes. And, so when they started the program, this was their vision. It's like, look, I've got this great new coating technology. Here's how it works. Precursor pulse, purge, second purge, third purge. It was very interesting, scientifically. The question is, what is it good for? Now, I know you all are sitting there like, wait a minute, Peter. It improves the lifetime of lithium-ion batteries. Surely that's useful, right? And the answer is, yeah, of course. So when they started the program, we gave them the business model canvas. We asked them to describe the value proposition. What is the thing that their invention does? And they said, well, it improves the stability of cathode anode materials for lithium-ion batteries and will improve the capacity and performance of those batteries, right? So that's wonderful. Everybody will like that. So we got them to say, okay, give this to me in a sentence. And they said, HF-resistant ultra-thin coatings on cathodes to improve stability of lithium-ion batteries. That is their innovation. Then we kicked them out of the building. Over the next 5 weeks, Anil and Devika spent time going to manufacturing centers and meeting people in the battery manufacturing industry. They went to battery trade shows, which most physicists never go to industry trade shows, even if the research that they're doing is relevant to a particular industry. They also spent time talking to individuals, even CEOs of battery manufacturing companies. They went to visit other companies that make cathodes and spent a lot of time getting out of the building. At one point, Anil even ended up meeting one of the CEOs of a battery startup, and they took a walk along the beach. 5 weeks, more than 100 customer interviews. By week 4, they had done about 50 customer interviews, and they were already beginning to really understand much more about the battery manufacturing market. They realized that while their initial value propositions of improving capacity was valuable, they realized in talking to people in manufacturing that there were some very specific value propositions that were specific to the cathode and the anode manufacturers. And in fact, that the people, they're different companies that actually make the cathode and the anode than the people who package the battery. In fact, one of the things that they began to work on was mapping out an entire ecosystem of all the companies and manufacturing steps for making lithium-ion batteries. And most scientists don't realize that industry sectors are very complex. I know it seems like there's something called a car company, like Ford Motor Companies, and metal goes in one side of the factory and out comes a finished Ford F-150. It turns out that the ecosystem of suppliers and sub-suppliers, consultants, advisors, software providers are all important to understand in figuring out if your invention is going to be useful to people. So by the latter part of the program, they had 80 interview counts, and they have been able to now map out the entire ecosystem and the supply chain for lithium-ion batteries. And it turns out that there were a whole set of companies that simply manufacture cathodes, and then there's a separate set of companies that do coatings. Those separate ingredients go into the battery manufacturer who packages the battery, and then it's often the case that those batteries are then sold in bulk to other companies that do testing and packaging, and then that package then goes out to what are called OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers, the people who use batteries for cars and various things. So it's a much more complex supply chain and ecosystem than Anil and Devika had realized initially. So by week 7, their value proposition had changed. Whereas initially it was HF resistant, ultra thin coatings on cathodes to improve stability of batteries, they realized that what they had was an ability to enable low cost, low cobalt cathodes for high energy density, stable lithium ion batteries. You notice what's changed in their value proposition? They no longer talk about the technology, the HF resistant coating. Doesn't matter. What they talk about is low cost and higher energy density. Those were the two value propositions that were critical to those customer segments that they spoke to. It's the same technology, it's the same coating, but it's framed differently, and the value proposition is expressed differently. So by the end of their program, not only did they have a complete business model canvas, but they had a clean understanding of the value proposition that their technology had for the specific customer segment. And in fact, 8 weeks in this program enabled them to start a range of new conversations with sponsors in these industry settings that have helped them further commercialize this technology. So they even were able to calculate the revenue stream of various business models. One business model involved partnering with the cathode manufacturer. The team at Resilicoat would take the raw cathodes from the manufacturer and coat them and send them back and get paid for that. Then the cathode manufacturer would sell to the battery manufacturer. Another version, a different business model, would be for Resilicoat to buy the raw cathodes from the manufacturer, coat them themselves, and then sell the coated cathode back to the battery manufacturer. These are the sorts of questions that come up as you analyze whether an invention has a potential to be an innovation. And these steps, much like doing science itself, have to be addressed. How do monies flow? Who gets the value in a particular invention? Who cares? Who benefits? Okay. Now, the reason I bring this up is that it's very natural for us as scientists to want to talk about our science. Like, my research is on graphene oxide membranes and their pH stability, blah, 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 zanes, blah, blah, neutron scattering, blah, blah, blah. Because that's what we're focused on in the academic setting. And frankly, when we talk to people from industry and we start off by talking about the science, they're like, can I get out of here? Okay? So what you like to do is be able to talk to people and elicit more questions. Rather than tell them what you know, ask them questions about what you don't know. Like, for example, what are the most challenging wastewaters to treat with reverse osmosis? Then an industry partner says, well, maybe I can talk to this kid and cool him in a bit. But really, the best way to approach industry partners and in industry interviews is not to talk about your science at all, but to basically just start by being the dummy. Just ask people about fundamental issues in their industry. What do you consider the most important material challenges for treating high pH wastewaters with membranes? Then in an industry conversation, people will start telling you what they do, what they see phenomenologically, and as you listen to the problems and challenges they encounter, that's when you can say, it turns out that I have a tough, very resistant membrane material I'm working on for my PhD thesis, it might be useful to address this customer segment's specific pain. Because we train physicists to be this, right? We train you to be professors, to speak, to teach, to be the expert. And the problem with that is that you're taught that you should have all the answers. And when you are commercializing technology, there is by nature no way that you can have all the answers. So while we teach you to be like this, in order for you to be successful in entrepreneurship, you have to be more like this. You have to be curious, open, and not try to answer these things yourselves. Go around and ask people advice and get answers from them. Now, I'm going to kind of wrap up my comments and talk about entrepreneurship and risk, because I know that one of the things that is very unsettling, especially to academic trained people, is the idea that, oh my God, you know, what am I going to do? I'm going to take this idea and I'm going to leave. I'm going to go off and try to make a business out of this thing. Am I crazy? What am I thinking? And I will admit, I felt very much the same way. Because when I was thinking about my first opportunities, you know, I knew that there were all these models out there of quote unquote successful innovators, successful entrepreneurs, right? And we know these people. And it's a very intimidating story because we have this idea that these people take enormous risk and, you know, make enormous rewards. And frankly, speaking personally, I wasn't that into risk, right? Risk does not sound like a lot of fun to me. And so I felt, frankly, I'm not sure I have what it takes. I'm not a risk taker. And you know, of all the models and the people that I had grown up with in terms of models of entrepreneurship, probably the most prominent was this guy, Ted Turner. Now, I don't know if you guys remember Ted Turner. Some of you are too young to remember Ted Turner, but Ted Turner was a legendary entrepreneur in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. He started CNN. He bought the Atlanta Braves, and in fact, he was such a legend that he even appeared and featured in ads for relatively mediocre scotch like Cutty Sark. But they called him Ted Captain Outrageous Turner. And as you read this description, you see things like Ted Turner does things people advise him not to do, and he succeeds at them. People, if somebody advised me not to do something, you know what I do? I wouldn't do it, right? So like this idea that entrepreneurs can only be successful by like challenging the odds and doing something outrageous was very intimidating to me, okay? Well, years later, I mean, and this issue about Ted Turner, like, so the story goes, the story I grew up with was that Ted Turner started with a small billboard company in the South, in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And in the 1970s, he had a vision. He saw that the future of advertising was television. And so he bought a broken down UHF TV station, Channel 17 in Atlanta, and he turned it into CNN. Wow. And then he saw the future. The future again was Major League Sports. So he bought the Atlanta Braves and turned that into a powerhouse. And then of course, the apotheosis of the whole story is he marries Jane Fonda. So this guy who like does it over and over again, audacious bets, it's a very intimidating model for us to think about, right? Well, years later, I actually encountered the first biography of Ted Turner, which is not his autobiography. It's written by another guy. And it's very interesting that the real Ted Turner story is a little bit different than what the newspapers say. Because it turns out that Ted had majored in accounting. His dad was the one who owned the billboard company. And Ted was a good accountant, don't get me wrong. But billboards generate a lot of cash. And in the 1970s, businesses that had a lot of cash, a lot of profits, would pay very high corporate tax rates. Remember that, kids? In the good old-fashioned days when we actually taxed corporations? Yep, it's true. They paid very high corporate tax. Well, Ted was an accountant, and he realized that if his family's business bought another venture that was losing money, he could take the profits from the billboard company and simply subsidize the losses of that other company, and he would offset the tax gains. He was going to lose the money anyway. TVs and billboards, as it turns out, were very similar businesses. It was all about selling ads, and Ted and his dad knew how to sell ads. It turns out that Channel 17 in the Atlanta area really didn't have very good advertising. Not a lot of people watched it, and so Ted had all this excess billboard space around Atlanta, so he could simply use the free billboard space he already owned to promote Channel 17. So it was a no-brainer. It turns out in 1975 that the purchase price for Channel 17 was $2.5 million. Now, friends, that even back then was an absurdly low price. Other TV stations at the same time were selling for 10x that price. It was a fire sale, okay? And so Ted simply engineered a stock swap with equity from his billboard company, and he purchased Channel 17 without any cash at all. Now, friends, does that sound like a big risk to you? Not so much, huh? Oh, and that purchase of the Braves in 1976? Well, it turns out that Channel 17 had acquired the broadcast rights for the perennially losing Atlanta Braves 4 years earlier. They had a long-term contract. They were paying $600,000 per year for that contract. Now, the owners of the Atlanta Braves were not making any money. They were losing about $1 million a year, and they wanted to sell the whole franchise for $10 million. Now, remember, Ted was a very good accountant, and he went through all the Atlanta Braves financials, and he noticed that they were doing some things that could lead to excess expenses. They were essentially not recognizing that some of their expenses could be deferred. And all told, it was about $1 million of things that they could potentially defer. So he basically found $1 million on their balance, on their books that they hadn't really realized. So Ted negotiated the following. One, he'd make a $1 million down payment for the Atlanta Braves, and he'd use their own money to do that. And then he'd pay out the remaining $9 million over 8 years. Okay, it turns out that he, because he owned Channel 17, already had the broadcasting rights, and he had to pay them $600,000 a year for the broadcasting rights. So basically, for an additional $650,000 per year for 8 years, Ted Turner could keep the broadcasting rights and own the entire team. Now, does that sound like a risk taker to you? It isn't. Because in fact, the actual track record of successful entrepreneurs is the opposite of the risk-taking myth that you and I have grown up with. It turns out that successful entrepreneurs are careful, they're analytical, they're risk-averse, and they're patient. That's not the model I grew up with. In fact, careful, analytical, risk-averse, and patient, it sounds a lot to me like a science graduate student. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell, in his article, The Sure Thing, points out that the best model for the successful entrepreneur is not a risk taker at all. It's a predator. And if you think about the model from a biological standpoint, predators are very interesting in how they succeed in the food chain. They're patient, they are observant. Predators often have very heightened senses, either vision or hearing. Also, predators roam over a large area. They're often smarter than their prey. They're analytical, competitive, and they are risk averse. They're not risk takers. But when an opportunity comes along, a great opportunity, the thing that distinguishes the entrepreneur is their willingness to act. They'll sit in the bush all afternoon waiting for the fattest wildebeest to come along, but when that opportunity comes, they move extremely quickly. And frankly, I'll admit that I think that's one of the things, one of the attributes that is hard for academically trained people. We're so used to analyzing that when the moment comes that we have a really critical and valuable opportunity, we often hesitate. We hesitate to take that opportunity. So I'll just wrap up and say, entrepreneurship is not about risk taking, although there is some risk, but successful entrepreneurship is mostly about analysis. And it's mostly a willingness to get out of your academic bubble, to get out of your disciplinary bubble and to roam around, just like the top predator. Roam over wide areas, be observant, gather data, question assumptions, think about what's missing in the world. But when that opportunity finally resolves itself, entrepreneurship is simply the willingness to jump into action, to take an action. And I will also point out that you don't just have to be a white man to be a successful entrepreneur. These people here and thousands others across the world have been entrepreneurs in business and entrepreneurs in public sector operations. And these people have changed the world by choosing to act, by seeing something that's missing in the world and choosing to direct their careers and their efforts to see that that thing becomes a manifest. So as you think about your own pathway, no matter where you are, whether you're still an undergraduate or in graduate school, or maybe you're a successful professional, I know it's natural for us to think about our academic experience and that we are the products of the academic environment. I just want to suggest that maybe you're not a product of the academic research enterprise. Maybe you're a spin-out. Maybe you yourself are simply a new way of seeing the world with the potential to go out and find something that isn't done or isn't done well and make an improvement in it and have a successful and exciting run. And as you've seen from my own career, even when you step away from an academic track or an academic career path, it doesn't mean that you couldn't go back, but it does mean that you have to do extra work to make sure that you keep your academic connections fresh. So wrapping up, and I invite you guys to put in questions. And in fact, I don't know, Crystal, if you will be reading questions,
Yeah,
but
yeah, Peter, I think I've got several lined up here, and so if it's okay with you, I can discussion.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to wrap up and say successful commercialization of a research product is kind of a stochastic process. It is a process involving chance and meeting the right person, okay? So if you are going to succeed in the stochastic process, you just have to increase the number of interactions. That increases your odds. This is why in the NSF ICorps program, we emphasize so much the value of those 100+ customer interviews, because with that number of interactions, new insights are bound to come your way. Those interactions and those insights might not just help you understand if you have a commercializable technology, but they will also give you insight into your research priorities. And one of the practical things we found from participants in the ICorps programs, the researchers, is many of them don't go on to start a company. They go right back to the laboratory and keep doing their research. But what they found is a new insight based on all those conversations with people from industry. And those new insights can be enormously insightful and nourishing and redirect you to more promising areas of research. I will tell you that the business model canvas and the ICorps programs are genuinely revolutionary. It is a major breakthrough in conducting research to industry. If you have the opportunity to participate in an ICorps program, I strongly recommend that you do. If you have an innovation that you are currently considering and trying to figure out, will this have commercial potential? The 8-week ICorps program is one of the most efficient and effective ways for you to understand whether that invention is actually an innovation, whether it creates value, and if so, to whom. And so I strongly recommend that you consider participating in one of those programs. And if you don't have an ICorps program at your university, look around to those nodes on that map. You can Google the NSF ICorps program and figure out where you could go and what cohort you could participate in. Another thing that I just have to emphasize over and over again is that coming from the academic, technological, physics orientation that we have, it's very natural for us to think that more complicated technologies are better. Often, when it comes to successful startups, simple is best. And what I found in my own career, and as I've talked to many entrepreneurs, is that the quote-unquote risks in an entrepreneurial career are not as high as you think. And frankly, in today's uncertain world, given the uncertainty that we have about academic employment, how we're going to proceed with R&D funding in this country, entrepreneurship may actually enable you to create more opportunities for yourself and have greater control over your life. That's certainly something that I've found. All right, and with that, Crystal and I will return to Q&A. And I just want to point out some of my articles. You can Google all these from Nature Magazine, and I look forward to hearing your questions. So, Crystal, what questions do people have for us?
Oh my goodness, lots of great questions coming in, Peter. And just again, a reminder to folks to put your questions in the questions box, and we will see them. Okay, so just to kind of start out, we've got a couple different perspectives questions being asked from. So, okay, we know you talked about customer segment, just going out, talking to people, understanding what a possible value proposition might be. It's very, very useful. But as a student, if I'm gonna try to do that, how do I approach individuals or companies that I just don't know anything about? Why would they want to talk to me? How do I get that conversation started?
Right, that's a great question, and often that's one of the first and biggest barriers that participants in the ICORE program have to overcome. How do I reach out to these strangers, and why will they talk to me? Well, two things. First of all, one of the topics we'll be talking about later this summer is the critical role of networking and building your network. And your network, of course, is simply the people you know and who are willing to help you. Now, it is unlikely that you directly know any of the people that you might want to talk to, but your network is the way in which you can find people who know those people and you can get an introduction. So often what I recommend is that people look through their, for example, their LinkedIn page and look to people who they're connected to through somebody in between and see if you can get an introduction from that person that you both know. Another avenue, which a lot of people don't appreciate, is that universities have enormous alumni communities. And your Career Planning and Placement Center has a database of past alums from your institution and where they're working. If you, for example, want to have an interview or ask questions of somebody at Bosch, one way to find the right person is to go to your alumni database and figure out who from Bosch has graduated from your university. Email them, just ask them for help. Tell them what you're interested in and the specific technology questions you have. The other thing is I think people have to appreciate that businesses and technical individuals, what I would call, most of the people in the private sector who are working on technology products and services are similar in training to yourself. Many of them have PhDs. And frankly, when somebody calls them and says, hey, I've got a potentially very helpful technology that might be important to your business, many of those people will take that call because they are always scouting for innovations. They're always scouting for new opportunities to improve their business. And so there's a lot of receptivity. I think a lot of people in academia worry like, well, why would anybody want to talk to me? The answer is because you're on the frontiers of science. And in a very short conversation, they might learn something very important from you. And frankly, having an interesting and unusual conversation for 30 minutes beats working for 30 minutes, right? So a lot of people enjoy those conversations anyway. So those are all strategies students and grad students can take to try to get in front of people. I would say that another area that we often forget is trade shows and trade associations. Now, we are used to scientific associations like the American Physical Society, right? Even in APS, there are thousands of members from industry. And so you could potentially look up and try to find people from various industry sectors who are members of APS and reach out to them. If we ever go back to in-person meetings, you may have the opportunity to meet people at exhibition halls, and those are great places to meet people. But honestly, what I have found is after the initial uncertainty, especially when we coach these teams in the first week, they're like, oh my God, how on earth am I going to get to 100 people? I don't even know 100 people. What we find is once you meet some person, you ask them the question, who else do you think I should talk to? And those introductions become the next steps and often very fruitful conversations. So those are all strategies that I think people should use, Crystal. That's a great question.
Okay, great. Thanks. So another quick question. I'm a foreign national postdoc, and I intend to return to my home country to continue my research career. How much of this advice is applicable outside of the US, or are there important differences I should consider?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Most of our US graduate students are foreign nationals, and you all are in our country, and believe me, should be treated much better, but that's a separate question. But many of you have a potential to stay, but many of you want to take this great opportunity and this educational experience you've had back to where you grew up to try to make important change and opportunity in your home country. I would say that the methodologies of the business model canvas are absolutely universal. In fact, the business model canvas itself was developed in Europe, not in the United States. It was developed by somebody getting his PhD in business. And so I think that the graphical framework of the business model canvas is extremely generalizable. It works in any language, it works in any culture, and in fact, it even works in non-business things, because you can take the same questions that are framed in a business model canvas, and you can translate them to nonprofit opportunities or even governmental programs. The same methodologies of analysis apply. And I would also say the one place where processes and strategies may have to differ a little bit is how you go about your networking. As many of you who've been in the United States for a couple of years know, Americans are very open in terms of communication, very friendly, they're very comfortable, and they're not very hierarchical. In other countries and other cultures, those environments might be much more respectful of sort of strata and where you are in the social order, and therefore it might be harder for you, especially as a young person, to reach directly up to senior people. And in some cultures that may actually be seen to be inappropriate. You are the best judge of how your home country's culture is best suited to things like networking. But frankly, when I have talked to foreign national students who have gone back to Belgium or Brazil or even Burkina Faso, what they have told me is that a lot of these networking tools that they learned in the United States are actually very usable. And one of the fun things that they find is that few people in their home countries know about these techniques. And they find that they thus have a particular advantage because of the things they've learned. So that's how I would see applying these things back where you might end up in your career. So great question. Thank you, Crystal.
Great. Yeah, great answer. And I guess in a certain sense, your upcoming webinars are kind of going to deal with that, how you build value proposition and how that can be, applied in lots of different kind of contexts. So for the webinar series, folks, don't miss it. As you know, Peter, a topic that's near and dear to my heart as someone who's working on the APS pipeline project, which deals with physics, innovation, and entrepreneurship education. I was also, what we're seeking to do is trying to build curricula that will help educators bring an entrepreneurial mindset to physics in an integrated way. Do you have any comments or thoughts about how to do that effectively? How can we integrate that into physics as a discipline?
Thanks. It's a very interesting question, Crystal. For starters, I think that one of the things we physics people could do is also reflect on how the education scheme is a little bit different in our sister engineering schools. Now, granted, many of APS members are actually in engineering programs or in engineering departments. But I think that the difference between the physics approach and the physics curriculum in like a school or an arts and sciences school versus a school of engineering is that engineers recognize that they need to expose their students to industry sectors fairly early on. So one of the things I see that engineering programs do is they often do tours. They will often organize, like if you are an undergraduate in chemical engineering, you may have a chance to tour a petroleum refinery, or a rubber synthesis company, and just to see, what is normally dry material on heat and mass transfer in your textbook really come alive in an actual manufacturing sector. And so that is one place where I think, the APS has already made enormous strides by growing its industrial physics kind of part of the community, and has communications on that subject. I would say the other thing that I have seen come from the undergraduate and graduate students themselves is that at UC Berkeley, for example, the grad students and postdocs have organized their own networking and outreach program, where every month they rent a bus and 40 of them pile into the bus, and then they spend a day in tours and interviews down at various companies around the Bay Area. And they do this not because like all the chemical engineers pile in a bus and go to Chevron, or all the computer scientists pile in a bus and go to Google. They actually have a wide range of graduate students of a wide range of disciplines. So the chemical engineers go to Google, and the art historians go to Chevron, believe it or not. And what's really interesting is that smart people are in high demand. And until you get out of the academic bubble and go to meet people in the practical work environment, you really don't have a sense for what key qualities they're looking for. And so that simple process of enforcing yourself as an undergrad or grad student to get off of the campus and to have informational interviews and networking opportunities with people in the outside world, I'd say that's been, as I've observed in people's careers, one of the single inflection points that they've begun to uncover new opportunities. And we're going to be talking about the power of informational interviews and networking later on in the series.
Great, that's awesome. Okay, one more question, and then I think we will unfortunately have to wrap up. But one more question. How does one approach finding value propositions for government or government programs? Is there a major difference in the approach for government kind of funders or audiences as opposed to industry?
That is a great question. And in fact, I have been working with the US Department of Energy very recently to utilize the same business model canvas technologies for government program managers. So I know those of us in academia, we sit there and say, okay, well, one of the key things that we need to do is we need to raise money for our research. So we're going to be looking at these various funding agencies and look at funding opportunities. These technologies of the business model canvas are very applicable to that challenge, because what's really interesting about funding? Ultimately, the decisions are made by people. I know that we think we know that we submit proposals and there's a merit review process and there's scoring and various things, but a lot of the decision, a significant fraction of the decision, is more subjective and about how a proposal is pitched relative to the goals of a program. It's very common that researchers will sit there and say, well, I've got a great idea for an invention and I think it'll fit in this program, and it's all focused on my invention. I think researchers could spend a little more time really doing more research on the programs that they're applying to, looking and understanding what's the rationale for why that program was given funding in the first place. What are the practical issues that even a basic science program like NSF, what are they trying to achieve? What's in the mission statement in that part of NSF, and how do those words and the goals that are expressed in those programs, how should I adapt my language and sort of frame the thing that I'm working on in such a way that it will align better with the goals of that program? That's the exact same thing that I showed you in that example from Sunil and Devika at Argonne National Lab. Fundamentally, they had the same technology, but they spent time understanding what the need was and what the perceived gaps were, And then they reframed and redescribed the same technology in terms that was better understood from the standpoint of the customer. And for many of you, your end customer is a program manager at some agency in the federal government. And better understanding his or her vision and needs and what they are looking for is one of the best ways that you can improve the chance of getting your proposal funded. That's a great final question, Crystal.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And again, we encourage you all to tune in for the remaining broadcasts. And the best way to find out that information is to sign up for the APS Summer Webinar Series. It's in the chat, but it's go.aps.org/summer-webinars. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for our official webinar today. You can certainly send a follow-up email to webinars@aps.org, and we'll try to get a follow-up. As I mentioned at the beginning, a recording of this video will be emailed to you. So as a registrant, you will receive a follow-up email in about 48 hours with the recording to this presentation. We'll also put it on the summer webinar page. And lastly, in order to help us continue to develop these webinar presentations, please take a moment. As soon as you leave, there should be a quick survey, 2 or 3 questions. If you could please fill that out and give us some feedback, we would really appreciate it. That wraps up today's event. Thanks again, Peter. We hope
Thank you, Crystal.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Nice to have everybody here today. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.
Yep. So that we hope you will join us next time. American Physical Society, copyright 2020, all rights reserved.